Now, I hope you understand the importance of thinking that this is an intelligent man who is giving an intelligent address to fundamental issues. So on the assumption that Jesus was smart and knew what he was talking about, can we all agree on that assumption? Everyone okay with that? He knew what he was talking about, so now he's giving a talk and he's dealing with the issues, so there's going to be an order in there. So why does he start with anger? Answer, because anger is the most fundamental problem in human life. Now, systematically it's not, but it is the most fundamental problem if you are aiming to transform people. You have to start there. And Jesus is not writing a theory. He can leave that to later people, everyone from St. Augustine to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others, and we need the theory, but he's not doing that. See, he is founding a community. He's founding a community of redemption. His project is to change people. And the theory's all there. It's in the background. Love of God, love of neighbor, that's been developing. Laws that are expressions of that, that's been developing for centuries. But that's not going to help a person who's down here in the guts of life, flailing about, caught up in their own anger or other blind feelings, trying to medicate perhaps to get out of them, or letting them fly and brutalizing everyone around them by violent language and emotions and actions. That's not going to do it. So that's why he starts here. And now then, as he goes on, see, let's suppose you start, let's say you decide, oh, I want to start at, I think I'd like to start at, maybe verse 41. Whoever will force you to go a mile, go with him too. You won't do well with that unless you've dealt with anger and contempt first. Right? Now that's actually probably talking about a Jewish person who is being forced by a Roman soldier to carry a load for 1 mile, because that was what you could be required to do according to the Roman government. And Jesus is saying something unbelievably radical. Right? The Roman was an uncircumcised pig. If a Jew went into a Roman household or had close connections with the Roman, they were unclean. They could not participate in religious rituals. They couldn't come into certain kinds of company for 3 days. Would you say that is dissing? I would say that's dissing, wouldn't you? No. If you haven't gotten out of your dissing mode, and if you're in your anger mode, you're probably going to diss because they're closely connected. You're not going to do anything with this. You're not going to do anything with the person who slapped you on one cheek and Jesus is saying, now turn the other one. Because you're full of anger. You're full of contempt. Probably because you're full of lusting. So you can't do it. These statements of Jesus are ordered in a progressive way. And so you have to understand the fundamental character of what he's saying about these first 2 sets of things that we gave on the list a moment ago, and these are covered in verses 21 through verse 32. So now, let's go back and work on anger. We talked a little bit about it earlier. Now we have to go deeper. We said some things like anger is not in itself wrong, but it is very likely to lead to wrong. The person who is quick to anger is a dangerous person. So, for example, when Paul in Titus 1:7 is talking about the requirements for elders and bishops and leaders, one of the requirements that he lays down is that they are not soon angry. They don't get angry quickly. And that's right next door to not given to much wine. Love, described in 1 Corinthians 13, remember one of the things about it is it is not easily provoked. Not easily. Can it be provoked? Yeah. But it's not easily provoked. And it doesn't stay provoked, if you remember how love is described there. It doesn't keep score. It lays things down, lets grudges go. You see, anger is dangerous because it gets us on a path that leads to things that harm other people. So now let me go a little deeper here into anger, and bear with me, please. Anger is actually will to harm. It is will to harm. That's why when someone is angry at you, you already feel hurt. Isn't that true? I've yet to find someone who even likes to be honked at. You like to be honked at? What does a honk mean? Did you ever think you'd be caught in a situation discussing what a honk means? Well, I mean, they would be words like, "You idiot, get out of my way," right? I mean, that's a mild version. Maybe that's a Christian version. Someone driving to church. Well, it's very interesting. Anger is built, and actually, this, when you understand this, this is a part. What anger really does is announce to us that something needs to be changed. Now, we may be wrong about that, but that's what it announces. Anger in the emotional realm is like pain in the physical realm. And actually, anger is a kind of pain. It's an uncomfortable feeling. And like when you step on a nail, you feel pain in your foot, and what that tells you is something is wrong. The pain tells you something is wrong. Something needs to be changed. And so the essence of anger is the will to push, to, if necessary, move you, harm you even. So people, then when people get caught up in anger, they set themselves on a course of harm. And that's where murder comes from. I don't know if you remember Jacob, when he came to die, said to his two sons, Levi and Simon, he said, "I don't want my soul to have anything to do with you. I don't want my blessing to get messed up with you, because you are angry people and you kill others and you slay animals." These were people who were possessed by anger. Ecclesiastes 7:9 says, "Anger reposes in the bosom of fools." Now, that doesn't mean everyone who's angry is a fool. It means if you find a fool, you'll find some anger. A fool is a heavy word in the Scripture. So we need to think deeply about the nature of anger, and we need to understand, for example, that anger is caused by our will being crossed. Doesn't matter how trivial it is. You know, out here in Los Angeles, we shoot people over parking in the wrong place. Right? It doesn't matter how trivial it is. If it crosses my will, and I am a person who is given to unrestrained anger, I will do anything to carry out that anger. Basically, it is an insult to your kingdom that causes it. Your will is being crossed, and really, no matter how trivial the issue, haven't you been around people who, for no reason at all, will just fly into a rage? It doesn't have to be something big. It just has to be experienced in a certain way. Now, some people come to the point where they're just angry people. They don't necessarily have to have anything to be angry at. But when they get into that position, then the smallest thing, don't we talk that way? We say the smallest thing will set them off, right? And that's always because you have a will in a certain condition. And that is what causes anger. And we want to say that anger is not a sin. It is something that is natural, like pain, but only if you have rock-solid Christian character can keep you safe with anger. And often people will say, well, God gets angry. Well, that's all right. God can handle it. You can bet on his character. You say, didn't Jesus get angry when he made the whip and went into the temple? And yeah, Jesus got, again, I can trust Jesus with stuff I wouldn't trust myself with. Right. Now, we do have situations where people do not have any other way of handling things, and they become angry, and sometimes it leads to change. And so I think that in some circumstances we should say, while anger might not be the best thing, it is better than some other things. And so we often have people who feel that, for example, if you're not angry about certain kinds of injustices, that you couldn't possibly be right, that either you're brain dead or your heart's not in the right place. And there's something to be said for that. And perhaps things do become so bad that in some situations the only way is to let anger explode. But that, I really want to say, is not the best way of handling things. And if you come to that, what will invariably happen is that the anger will evoke anger on the other side. Unless you've got someone over there that is rock-solid Christian character, which is unlikely, though they may think they have it, right? So we're not talking about repressing anger. We're not talking about denying anger. Those are bad things. We're talking about not being angry. And still being able to stand for what is right, be solid, stand to the death if necessary. That may sometimes verge over even into things like warfare. But if war is inevitable or necessary, in some circumstances it is still true that anger and contempt are not. And you will certainly recognize that anger and contempt, that warfare conducted in anger and contempt, is many times worse because of that. Many times worse. So those are things that we need to have in mind. And we can say, I believe that everything you can do with anger, you can do better without it. You may have to learn how to do that. And if you act without anger, you're going to have to educate others that you really do mean what you say, though you're not angry. Right? And in many respects, human beings just live at a level where if you don't act angry, they'll think you don't mean what you say. Just like a dog, you can say the most awful things to a dog in a kind tone, and it'll just wag its tail and lick your hand. Right? Or you can say the best things to the dog in a tone of reproach and anger, and it'll just slink off with its tail between its legs. And there's so much that CEOs that rule their operation by the threat of being angry. And people would sort of drag along until that came over the horizon, and then when they got angry, they'd start to move. You see, this living without anger is a matter of re-educating everyone around you, especially if you're in a position of responsibility. So I say here, everything you can do with anger, you can do better without it. Understanding you have to go through that process both with yourself and with others. Now, one of the reasons why anger is so dangerous is because it's always righteous in the moment. I've already talked about that a little bit, so I don't want to spend time on it, but just call your attention to it again. Anger, you check this out, and check out everything I say, of course, but I mean, you do want to test this all against your own experience. And it's very rare that you ever meet someone who is angry who doesn't feel like their anger is completely justified. And moreover, they will feel that their anger justifies what they do in anger. And so that keeps us from being critical. And anger is a feeling, and all feelings, when they come up, they don't raise the question of, am I right? Thoughts and beliefs tend to do that, but feelings simply tend to stand there in your face and yammer at you and say, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. And this is true. For example, you get a person who is caught up in a love affair. They will normally feel completely justified in all the feelings that they... Now, once they subside and so on, then they can criticize them. But in the moment of feeling, there is not the appropriate kind of reflection and criticism about what it all means. And that's one reason why we have to be extremely careful with feelings, and anger is one of the most important ones for us to deal with. Anger is in our body. We've talked earlier about how we farm character out to our bodies. And that's why it so easily bypasses our mind and our spirit if we are not well formed to recognize what's happening. We will act in anger before we think. That's where our mean Christians come from, you see. You have people who are professing Christians and they have not come to terms with their anger, and then when things go contrary to their will, they're unhappy, they attack others, they withdraw from others, and normally they're not really on top of what their feelings and thinkings are. After 9/11, as we endearingly call it, every church I went into was just a buzz like a hive of bees that had been hit with a stick. Everyone was so angry, and they didn't know what to do with it. And that's unfortunately typical because, I mean, where do you train as a Christian to deal with anger and to come out of that situation that Jesus describes? Look, here's what he says. You've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder will be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother, and there are two versions here, if you like the easier version, without a cause. Actually, it doesn't make any difference for the point at hand. Shall be guilty before the court, that is to say, have the same kind of guilt as one who murders. And whoever shall say to his brother, Raka, now Raka is an Aramaic term that's uncertain in its origins, but the way it's pronounced, it sounds like the noise you make when you're clearing your throat to spit. I won't demonstrate, but you can practice in the solitude of your room. Raka. Everyone who says that shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. That's even worse than being angry. And he goes on to say, everyone who says, you fool. See, these are all expressions of an attitude of harm towards other people. Shall be guilty enough to go into the fires of Gehenna. This isn't Hades, this is Gehenna that is being referred to. So you can see now, Jesus is actually putting a pretty heavy weight on stepping out of anger. And the reason that we have so many angry Christians is because they're not trained out of that. They're not taught out of it. No one lays the foundation for getting out of it. And so now we want to move on here to the next screen and talk a little bit about that, stepping out of anger. Now, since anger is a will phenomena, that's where you have to begin. And so, not just to get rid of anger, but because it is right and good in itself, stepping out of anger presupposes that you have surrendered your will to God. Now, that means, among other things, that you have accepted the fact that you don't have to have your way. All right, so that other person did park in your parking place. Now what? Well, it could be the end of the world. Or it could be an inconvenience. And you might decide, for example, that you'll have compassion on the person. That doesn't mean you wouldn't speak to them about it or do what is necessary in order to correct the situation. It just means you won't do it in anger and contempt. So surrender to the will of God affects a pervasive change in all of our life. And now this is the meaning of the cross in spiritual growth and in redemption. This is the meaning of the cross. See, Jesus did not die on the cross so that we wouldn't have to die on the cross. He died on the cross so that we could join him in his death on the cross. So what does Paul say in Galatians? I am crucified with Christ. What does that mean? That means that I have accepted the same posture in my life as Christ did. I have given up my life to God. I have laid it down. Here's, I mentioned William Law yesterday, I think it was. There's a wonderful passage here from that book, A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. And I just read a few words from it. If therefore you live in murmurings and complaints, accusing all the accidents of life, it is not because you are a weak, infirm creature, but it is because you want the first principle of religion. You lack the first principle of religion, right belief in God. Wow. Maybe I should read that again. Might help me. He's talking about always being thankful to God in life. And he says, if therefore you live in murmurings and complaints, accusing all the accidents of life, it is not because you are a weak, infirm creature, but it is because you lack the first principle of religion, a right belief in God. For as thankfulness is an express acknowledgement of the goodness of God towards you, so repinings and complaints are as plain accusations of God's want of goodness toward you. On the other hand, would you know who is the greatest saint in the world? It is not he who prays or fasts most. It is not he who gives most alms or is most eminent for temperance, chastity, or justice. But it is he who is always thankful to God. who wills everything that God wills, who receives everything as an instance of God's goodness, and has a heart always ready to praise God for it. All prayer and devotions, fastings and repentance, meditation and retirement, all sacraments and ordinances are but so many means to render the soul thus divine and conformable to the will of God, and to fill it with thankfulness and praise for everything that comes from God. Something to think about. So, stepping out of anger is going to mean the surrender of our will to God. Now, what about things that are wrong? We can still act with reference to them. We don't just let everything stand. We speak truth and we live it, but we don't do it in anger and contempt. And the reason for that is we know that He is taking care of us. We know that our real interests are safe. So now suppose the guy parks in my parking place. I have to park a block and a half away and walk to my apartment. Well, can you do that praising God? Can you do that with thankfulness that you found a parking place 2 blocks and a half away? Then can you speak to the person who parked in your place with compassion and love and understanding of the weakness of people who do such things and their needs and so on, and have a discussion with him? Well, you see, if you do this, you talk with him, what's he going to do? He's going to get mad probably, right? Because he knows he's wrong. And he's uneasy to begin with. And now you come along and point this out. So now what's your response going to be to that person? You're not going to get mad. You're going to stand there and let him pour vitrefusion and bile upon you. And you're going, because you're not an angry person now. Right? But you're going to be firm. You're going to ask him not to do that again. Explain to him the situation. God bless you. Have a good evening. I'll be praying for you. So now, what do you think that's going to do to that person? Now suppose instead you go and you whack on his door and you start hollering at him and cursing him. He's going to curse you back and holler at you and feel completely justified in doing it because you came and cursed him and followed and hollered at him. You see, anger hurts. I don't care if people, I'm cool, baby. I'm not hurt, they say, as the blood drips down their shirt. They're wounded deep. I'm cool, baby. But they don't want you to know they're hurt. Right? So you get all this silliness, absolute silliness. And the way you short-circuit that and dump it somewhere, and it takes a while, because you see, that person now that you're talking to, this isn't a dive-bombing situation. You're entering a relationship with that person when you do that. They entered a relationship with you when they parked in your place. And now, this is the kind of work you have to do if you're going to understand anger and how to get out of it. So you have to actually, you can't just live in it. You have to understand that other people have to be drawn. They're used to living in this little shell. You know, those little crabs that come out of their shell and you move towards them and they back into their shell. That's very like human beings. So you have to sort of say, wait a minute, not back in your shell. So you stay with them. Now, you don't make a law out of this. You use your brains. You use good sense. That, by the way, is one of the things that many people read Jesus' teachings as if he were some kind of an idiot, you know. And they think, well, you stop thinking and you just do what he says. Never. Never. You see, what you're being called to is responsible selfhood, responsible humanity. And responsible humanity means that you think in terms of relationships, not in terms of acts, much less tit for tat. I spoke about firing someone in Christian love. See, normally that means the relationship is divorce. See, and this is a wrong attitude to what goes on between human beings. But when we have a painful encounter with someone, we try to scuttle back into our little rock or shell, and we hope never to see that person again. But now as a Christian, you're living in the neighborhood, you're going to see that person again. Might even send them a Valentine. See, you maintain the relationship, and that's a part of recognizing the care of God and the supervision. As angry as I might be at this person, in a sober moment I realize God loves that person. God loves that person. So now, they may not even be right with God, but God cares about them. And if I'm going to relate to them, then I have to be in a position to recognize that. And God cares for me also. He cares for me. So now, with this in place, this point, not getting what you want is not a big deal. See, that's you begin to step out of anger, because anger always comes when you make things a big deal. Not a big deal. Now, sometimes it is a big deal in other respects. So if it has meaning other than just I want my way, then you stay with that, and you don't change what you're saying and what you're doing. You're just not angry about it. And because you're not angry about it, you don't evoke all of the angry emotions from the other side that would come if you were angry. Now you get some, but you see, when you get those, that's where you stand steady and let them work their way out. And this applies to all kinds of relationships. Now, I've already talked about the meaning of the cross here. You see, that's the meaning of the cross, is that there is life beyond this event. There's life outside this event. And now then, the Christian, the disciple of Jesus, living in the kingdom, has learned that no matter what the event is, there's life outside that event. Well, we need to talk a little bit about contempt, because anger and contempt, they're twins. You know, anytime you find contempt or anger, the other one is close by, often locked in an embrace, but in any case, they're always close by. Because if you think, if you have contempt towards something or someone, you regard them as less worthy or worthless. And so then it is more appropriate or easier to do the things that would harm them, to be angry at them. So, I mean, you think of the whole history of things like racial conflict, and you look at the history of that, where people of another tribe is quite fitting to eat them. Not your tribe, of course, but it's quite fitting to do whatever to them, to degrade them, to deprive them. That's always what goes into contempt. It regards the other as worthy of harm or loss. So if you have contempt for someone and something bad happens to them, you are certainly less likely to grieve over it. you're more likely to say, well, they deserve it. And you certainly are less likely to do anything to help them or to act for their advantage. So then we've talked about dissing someone, that's all. The use of filthy language is always an expression of contempt. And many people can't find anything wrong with using filthy language. It always brings the element of contempt in, and that contempt is not a good thing. And it makes anger easy, and it issues from anger. You see people in a fight, they will always move to contempt. Filthy language, it always goes that way. That's built into the nature of anger. If you get in a fight and the anger is flowing, contempt will be right there. And needless to say, contempt does not mean love. So now, one of the things we can do is resolve to learn to live without contempt. We can do that. And the answer to contempt is love. You cannot have contempt for things that you love. You test, again, like always I say, test this out in relationships. Test it out. Watch others, observe life, observe yourself, and see whether or not these things are true. We can give up the right to have contempt of people. Many people say, well, I have a right to be contemptuous of them. No, actually you don't. But the human way of looking at things might suggest that you do, that you have a right to be contemptuous. You can give up the right to be angry. Say, well, I have a right to. Well, in some cases you may, but the question is whether or not you ought to do it anyway. You have a right to do a lot of things that are not good for you. So that I think a great moment for our own spiritual growth is the time when we decide, I give up the right to be angry. I'm not going to exercise it. I abandon contempt. I can live without it. I'll be better off without it. Then I have to learn how to act against wrong without being angry, and that's a lesson in itself. Now, I realize that, and when we get to questions later on, you may want to go on in this for some length, and I realize that there are some real issues here that have to be dealt with. I do want to encourage you to study anger and angry inductively in your Bible. That is to say, get your old concordance down, or now you probably got it electronic, and search anger and angry. Get those words and study them in the biblical context. And that's a good occasion to say, now everything I say to you in these series, it has to come out of the Bible. If it's not biblical, we don't want it. And that comes from what we said earlier about the Bible in relationship to our knowledge of reality and knowledge of what is good and right. God has provided the Bible. It is the kind of thing it is because God thought that was best it be that way. So it isn't a little rule book. It isn't a theological treatise. It's a window on life. And so, but you study it and there emerges from it the profound teachings that we need. And I think you will see that about anger if you study it that way. Now, you're not apt to study it that way if you don't take seriously the idea that Jesus and Paul and others, that we should just lay aside anger. Don't be there. Lay aside contempt. Don't be there either. In the sermon itself, you do want to look at the positive side on anger and contempt. I should just mention this. See, when he goes, do not commit adultery, then he says, I say to you, don't be angry without a cause or whatever, don't express contempt, don't call people fools. Then he switches over to the positive. So you need to understand that verses 24 through 26 is teaching the positive side of dealing with anger. So he says, therefore, in verse 23, if you are presenting an offering at the altar, and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go your way, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Now understand what that's doing. See, follow the texture of the sermon. What is that doing? That's still talking about anger. And what it's doing now is it's contrasting the right attitude to the wrong attitude. And now he gives you teaching about the kind of thing that the person who has the right attitude will do. It isn't just they won't call them fools. They won't be contemptuous of them, and they won't be angry at them. There's a positive attitude. Now, get this picture. Jesus takes a situation where there's a great temptation to overlook the moral dimension of life in favor of the ritual dimension. Why does he pick that? If you are presenting your offering at the altar. Well, one reason is because that is precisely a situation you do not interrupt for any reason other than some other ritual consideration. You can interrupt the process that he's talking about here if it were to turn out, for example, that the offering had something wrong with it, or that the priest had not set things up in the right order so that the instruments that were used and all of that were proper. Then you could interrupt it. See, there's always a tendency in religious institutions to glorify those processes to such an extent that people wind up substituting ritual behavior for moral rightness. And Jesus is going counter to that, see. He's suggesting an outrageous thing, in short, that you would interrupt the process of your offering in the temple to do some trivial thing like go make things right with your brother. Now, of course, I don't mean it's trivial. What he's saying is that's the really important thing, and that it's so important that you would be prepared to interrupt the ritual in order to go take care of it. Now, why is he saying that? To show what it's really like to not just not kill your brother, but to really love. Do you understand what I'm saying there? See, the prophets had always had this problem with people substituting sacrifices and keeping days and all of that and saying, oh, we're just wonderful because we do that, when they were morally debauched. You know your Old Testament well enough to know that, I think. Right? They're always dealing with that issue. The tendency to substitute ritual behavior for genuine goodness and rightness. And that is what Jesus is talking about. He goes on. He takes another case here, which is very touchy. He says, makes friends quickly with your opponent at law. Now, these are people who are engaged in a lawsuit, as we might say, today. So make friends with the person you're having a contest with. What is that about? That is a further illustration of the genuine heart of the kingdom person that is so far from killing them. See, that's the background that he's talking in. So far from killing them that if they go to law, they're friendly. You ever seen people going to law? Ever done jury service and watched the people engaged in lawsuits? Would you be inclined to describe them as friendly? Well, that's not the way. Now, you see people who will say you're never to go to law, and maybe they qualify it and say, with a Christian. I know a man once who would not do business with Christians. He was a businessman because he said, if things go wrong in our dealings, I can't sue them. Now, that's profound, isn't it? He had read this passage and thought that it said you shouldn't. It doesn't say you shouldn't go to law. It tells you how to go to law. Go to law in love. Be friendly. So the person wins the case. Well, Jesus says, if someone sues you and takes away your overcoat, and you later see that they need your jacket and you have an extra jacket, what do? You say, you SOB, you took away my overcoat, I wouldn't give you anything. Right? No, Jesus says, give him your jacket. Now, folks, look here. Suppose we just got that far. Do you see what it's going to do to everything else? I mean, if you pull the anger and contempt out of pornography, how much pornography do you have left? Almost none. I would be willing to say none. Am I making any sense to you? See, Jesus understood the structure of the immoral life. He understood that. And when he goes at it, he just pulls the foundations out from under it. If people were not contemptible of others, there would be no pornography. It's always full of contempt, and anger is close at hand. And so they're willing to degrade others and see other people degraded. Now, I'm just talking about pornography. But see, the reason I'm bringing that up is because now Jesus is going to move on here to sexuality. And he's going to talk about it in a day when there were people, just like there have always been, who might not commit adultery and might say, well, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Are there still people like that today? Yes, of course there are. And often they are religious people. Maybe they're even religious leaders. I think that's what Jesus was talking about, because he understood that many of these people who were religious leaders in his day, Pharisees and scribes, were people who would commit adultery if they had the occasion and were not fearful of what would happen. But if they were not contemptuous already, they wouldn't be bothered with that. If they were not angry with their wife, or wives in this case often, unsatisfied with them, they wouldn't be looking elsewhere. And so he takes up this topic now in terms of the act of adultery and goes to the heart. He says, I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman to lust, and if your version reads and lust, would you please mark it? Mark the and out. Give you time to look, because this is such an important matter. The language here is very clear. It does not say looks and lust, but looks to lust. You have an NIV? What does it say?
Lustfully.
Looks lustfully. Yeah. So that's and. So now you check your Greek, do your sources on this. This is a particular kind of thing that is often done. For example, apparently there were construction workers in Jesus' day. Now then, this has spread to television commercials. You know, the Pepsi commercial that has the young women standing in the window and the construction worker with his shirt off having a Pepsi. So, I mean, there's the familiar sort of thing. It's looking to lust. And you need to understand in this matter, because you can easily enslave yourself to things that are you think are wrong that aren't. You need to distinguish thought of sin from inclination to sin, and that's temptation, and readiness to sin. Adultery in the heart is 3. It's number 3. It's not temptation. Temptation is not sin. And it's not thought. Thought is not sin. Adultery in the heart is manifested by 3, and it's manifested by cultivating desire. When you look to lust, you look in order to lust. And that manifests 3. By not just having to, but rather inciting to, purposefully to enjoy dwelling on that. So now we have to talk about, why does one do that sort of thing? See? For the most part, it's just a habit. It feels good. We enjoy titillation. We enjoy imagining things we might like to do, even if we wouldn't do them. And so this habit of indulging feeling becomes a major part of how we get through life. It's a part of that turn to the body that we discussed earlier, especially in relationship to Romans 1, because it's a source of gratification and good feeling. Actually, I think anger and contempt become that for a lot of people. They actually feel better when they're enjoying being contemptible of others, because it gives them a sort of kickback effect. They feel superior, and that's a good feeling. It's all a part of the sensualistic approach to life, where feelings are treasured, and often people live in imagination just because they enjoy that, and perhaps they don't have many sources of satisfaction. They're not experiencing success and drama in their life, and so they get it out of what we call sex and violence. So now, leaving cultivated lust, you make the decision to go no further than 1. And in fact, you decide to train yourself to avoid 1 as much as possible. It's still, if it happens, it's not a sin. It's not something that is wrong. It's just that you need to know that when you move there, you move away from it, you don't go further with it. So now how do you do that? Well, it's very important to decide to do it. We decide to do it. We're not going to do this. Now, it isn't like the law of gravity where you can't escape it. And many people seem to talk that way. But if you will experiment with it, you will find, just like covetousness and other things, you don't have to be drawn into it. And your world, presently, of course, is just soaked with it. So you have to recognize that and say, I'm not going to be a part of that. The discipline that I call chastity, and I discuss it in the spirit of the disciplines, not a good name for the discipline, it's more a name for the outcome of the discipline, is something you can learn to do. You can train yourself to live with thoughts successfully by choosing to simply avoid them for periods of time. You don't have to dwell on sexuality in relationships. You can actually train yourself to think about life and relationships in a way that doesn't involve that. But you have to break habits, and most of us have habits that run in the other direction, so that's a project. will help you in doing that if you indeed decide to view the person you encounter as, and here we go back to language we've already used, an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe. Your view of them will be lifted, and lifted in such a way that you will not have the same inclinations in relationship to them, and whatever thoughts that occur will be dismissed. Now then, this condition is what could be called sexual purity. And I don't know if you have a way of spelling that out, or if in your circles people aren't apt to talk about it very much. But you need a way of thinking about what sexual purity is. And that does not mean that you are asexual or that you don't have thoughts of sex or appropriately engage in it if you're married, or that you are a sexual being. That's right. But sexual purity means that you are not enslaved and accustomed to degrading yourself in that relationship or degrading others, because it always comes in that way. Now, we can also help ourselves here by training ourselves to take the initial signs which we used to use to get ready to cultivate your lust as signs to bless, to help, to pray for. That should be for the person in question. As long as you engage in these activities, you're not going to have trouble with the others. But you have to train yourself to do it. And learning to see people as unceasing spiritual beings with an eternal destiny in God's great universe opens the door then to doing these other things and using the customary signals that one might have used, let's say that the proverbial construction worker would use, to just turn the other way. And we can train ourselves to do that. Okay. Now then, let's go back further. Since we have already surrendered self-will, getting what you want, you will not feel deprived. See, the way the world runs, a person is apt to say, oh, I'm being deprived if I can't do this. I'm missing something important. I'm missing something good. Now you have to get out of that. You're not missing something good. You're missing something that's harmful and can lead to much worse things. So the surrender of self-will has to lay the foundation not only for anger, but ceasing to cultivate lusting, abandoning them. It all hangs together. And I hope that's one of the things that you will see as you go along. Now then, what do we do as Christians? Well, we train ourselves, and then as we're leaders and we're leading a group of disciples who want to be done with anger and with all of this other stuff, then we train them in the things that we're talking about right here today. And we don't treat things like anger and contempt and sexuality as if they were sort of peeled grapes that it's impossible to pick up, and as slippery and as incapable of getting a hold of, because now we've thought about it and we have teaching about it. It may have struck us that actually Jesus knows something about it and has something to teach us about it. And then we're ready to act. And in our groups and in our lives individually, we can begin to take steps to change that inside, the mind, the will, and the feelings in such a way that we are able to do the things that Jesus said. You know, that's crucial, because if what I've said to you is right, we have to grow in grace by our own actions as well as receive that grace from God. So we have to know what to do. So we don't just say, oh, I failed again. I'm going to try harder next time. We don't say that. We say, how did that happen? And we have to go through all the stages. We have to have the vision that it's okay if I didn't do that. It would be okay if I didn't engage in that. my ears wouldn't fall off. I'd still be a human being. It's okay. Then we go to the stage of decision. Say, I'm going to be that way. And then we get into these details and we do whatever is necessary in addition to the sorts of things I've talked about to help us become a different kind of person on the inside. Now, agape love is the sure answer to lust. What you love, you will treat lovingly. But you have to understand the details and see what goes into that. Now, then, just finally here, let's go back to disciplines, because we've talked about the vision, the intention, and the means, and we have to say that when you come to implement this, for example, dealing with anger, you're going to have to think in terms of disciplines that will help you change. Remember the principle of indirection, which I talk here again about. You're becoming different inside, and you have to do the things that change you. So solitude and silence and fasting and study and all of those things. You engage in those without asking the question directly of how is this going to change me? Will it modify my behavior? It will modify your behavior, but remember, you don't aim at modifying behavior. You aim at changing the insides. And then when the insides are changed, the behavior changes. Disciplines enable us to do what we cannot do by direct effort. So you can't stop cultivating lusting by trying to stop cultivating lusting. You cannot do it. You have to go through the process of understanding and habit change, habits of envy, other relational, see, those have to change from the inside. So you can't do that by direct effort. So disciplines enable us to do what we cannot do by direct effort. So we just go into solitude, we go into silence, we practice worship, we change all of those attitudes that lead us into degrading positions, and then we're no longer there. And worship is so tremendously important. Genuine worship, admiration of God, astonished reverence of God. That's a good word for worship, is astonished reverence for God. Many of our songs express those. Some we don't know any longer, but if you go back and read a lot of the old hymns, maybe you know the old hymn, Immortal, Invisible, God Only Wise. See, that's a tremendously powerful theological song. It exalts God in such a way that the back effect is to change us. John Newton's old hymn, how tedious and tasteless the hours when Jesus no longer I see. Sweet prospects, sweet birds, and sweet flowers have all lost their sweetness to me. The midsummer sun shines but dim, the fields try in vain to look gay, but when I'm happy in him, December's as pleasant as May. His name yields the richest perfume, and sweeter than music his voice. His presence disperses my gloom and causes all within me to rejoice, and makes all within me rejoice. I would, were he always thus nigh, have nothing to doubt or to fear. No mortal so happy as I, my summer would last all the year. You see, that's worship. Now when you're living there, that changes you. Of course, study has to go with worship to inform the mind. The emotions and the mind come together. And so we come to the position that you see expressed in Psalm 16:8. You remember that great messianic psalm. And in 16:8, David says, I have set the Lord always before me. He is at my right hand. I will not be moved. That's discipline. That's what the disciplines do. And they work by indirection. And they are not aimed at behavior, but the changes come in behavior. So solitude and fasting and so on have tremendous effects on these areas of anger and lusting. I want to read you a letter here from a young lady who had been experimenting under direction. She had been experimenting with fasting and solitude, and the effect that it had on her. Young Japanese woman, actually, and a friend of mine had gone from Fuller Seminary over to do some work there teaching in Japan. This young lady gave this testimony. Just listen to these beautiful words. She said, "The more I practice this discipline of solitude and silence, the more I appreciate their strength, and the less I become judgmental and skeptical. And the more I learn from them, the more I accept things I didn't really like about others. The more I accept them as uniquely created in the image of God. The less I talk, the fuller are words spoken at an appropriate time. The more I value others, the more I serve them in small ways. The more I enjoy and celebrate my life. The more I celebrate, the more I realize that God has given me wonderful things in my life. And the less I worry about my future. I will accept and enjoy what God is continuously giving me. I think I'm beginning to really enjoy God." And see, that's how disciplines work. The disciplines that are tried and true in the life of the biblical people and more recently always have that effect of changing the whole sense of life and the sense of God, so that you're no longer driven by feelings, by hungers, by needs, and so on, because you're centered in the sufficiency of God. Now, we need to say a little more about chapter 6 of the sermon. Perhaps, well, let's don't go there directly. Let's finish up chapter 5 just quickly. I've talked about these two main topics of anger and contempt on the one hand and cultivated lusting. But then as you go on through that sermon and culminate at the end where it's talking about being perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, because now you love those who hate you, your enemies, you love them. He goes through a series of things here affecting not only divorce, because you see, if you have already dealt with anger and contempt and cultivated lusting, there's not going to be much of a problem with divorce, because divorce without anger, contempt, and cultivated lusting will almost never occur. There may be some other reason, but normally they come out of those conditions. But then he goes on to talk about what we discussed last night, namely letting your yes be yes and a no be a no. And then he moves on to retaliation. The old law said, let there be you can have an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. Actually, that was a merciful law, because it was a rule that if someone knocked out one of your eyes, you couldn't knock out two of theirs. You were just restricted to one. Same way with teeth and so on. It was a way of restricting revenge. Now, if you have already taken care of these earlier issues, then you'll be ready to deal with retaliation. Now, Jesus says, don't resist those who are evil. And I hasten to say, this is talking about a personal relationship Don't resist them in the way they're attacking you. So if someone slaps you, don't slap them back. Remain vulnerable to them. Now, if you are a person who's operating out of your own desires and your anger, you won't be able to do that. And there are all sorts of ways of responding. Everyone has heard the person who says, well, I'll turn the other cheek and then I'll knock their head off. You see, that's thinking legalistically. That's like the person who has to go a second mile. Well, maybe the person doesn't want to go a second mile, and you say, well, Jesus told me to go the second mile because so I have to carry your load on down the way here. You don't think about it legalistically. You think it in terms of the Spirit of Jesus, the realities of the kingdom, of how love works, and then these things begin to fit in place. You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. It's interesting in this case, verse 43, you can't get hate your enemy out of the old law. So it isn't quoted. The part about love your neighbor is quoted, but hate your enemy had actually been added on by the time of Jesus as a requirement. You should hate your enemy. And that's something that still is in the world today. But Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, in order that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. That means in order that you can have the nature of your Father in heaven. So you be children. Children inherit the nature of their Father. Here's what he does. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. That's what he's like. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? In other words, what's the big deal about that? If you love those who love you. And he goes on to say, everyone does that. If you greet your brothers only, what do you more than others? Even the Gentiles do the same thing. That is, Gentiles, remember, these are people who do not know God. Now, I'm piling stuff on here, and I know it gets a little heavy because you start thinking in terms of, how am I going to do all of that? Someone comes, give unto him that asks of you, and him that would borrow from you, don't turn them away. Give them what they want. Can we actually do that? Well, again, we can't if we're living on our own resources and all we know is controlling things so that they come out the way we want them. If we have abandoned that, there will be cases where people will ask you for something and they have no claim on you at all, but you will give to them. And you will not base it on some prior claim, but simply on their need. And basing the giving of something just on need is a characteristic that you will see in people who have learned to live in the kingdom of God. Now, you're going to make a law of it? I hope not. Right? Because sometimes there will be other claims on things you might give to a person. A case a couple of weeks ago, a man who was asked for money, and the money he had was devoted to paying the bills that he already owed. Should you give that money to people who ask you? Well, he was torn by that, and he stepped into the situation in a way that he was bothered by the legalism of it, and he did give the money, and God did give him what he needed to pay the bills. But see, you're going to have to make a judgment about this. And when you look at all these things about turning the other cheek and remaining vulnerable, about giving to those who ask of you, going the second mile, you do not abandon your responsibility to make a judgment about what you have to do and foist on these teachings a legalism that says you always do exactly that. You see, this is describing a circumstance where you are growing in your understanding, and there will be occasions when you do this. And in fact, probably in most occasions, you will do it. But there will be occasions when you don't do it. Now, when that's true, what will be the reasoning? The reasoning will be because love obliges you to do something different. Yes, go ahead. Self-defense is a legitimate thing. What is not legitimate is to simply give back what you got. Because he hit me, I hit him. Right. Self-defense merely to defend yourself? No. There has to be a larger issue. Right. So you have to think these things through, and the only alternative is to, and this is what has happened to the teachings of Jesus over and over again through the ages, the only alternative is to turn these into laws, and then they will paralyze you because you actually won't know what to do. Because often they will force you into conditions of conflict. Right? And so you have to then say, well, I understand that these are practical teachings, and the principle that Jesus teaches on is to contradict the prevailing assumption. So the prevailing assumption is what? You don't give to people just because they ask you. Right? You give to people because they have some prior claim on you. When people hit you, you hit them back, right? And that's right and proper. No, Jesus says that's not the way it goes. Now, you have to take this teaching along with what we said about Luke 14 yesterday. Was it yesterday? You remember the talk about taking the seat out in the kitchen and waiting for them to call you up? Or the teaching about when you have a dinner, don't invite your neighbors and your relatives. Right? So you have to understand that in these teachings, Jesus is contradicting the prevailing assumptions about what you do. And he's saying that for the child of the kingdom, there will be many circumstances in which you will go contrary to those assumptions because you're alive in the kingdom. And we have to go over this slowly and give it time to sort of soak in, because I think this is a hard lesson. Because we keep wanting Jesus to just tell us what to do. And so we'll even take something like, for example, don't call people fools. And we try to make a rule out of that. And you can never catch the reality of the kingdom in a set of rules. I know my grandmother would not allow me to call my little playmates fools. Well, I solved that problem quickly. I said, I'll just think it. You think I satisfied the rule? Well, if you interpret it legalistically, I did. I didn't call them fools. I just thought it. It didn't say don't think it, does it? Didn't say that, right? I guess I can think it then. Now see, if you take these teachings and try to make them rules of righteousness, you will always fail. They will become impossible to do, and you will make Jesus look like he is an idiot. If, on the other hand, you understand that he's talking about having a certain kind of heart which may well, out of love, go exactly contrary to what is treated as righteousness. Go the mile you have to. Don't hit someone unless they've hit you, and then you can hit them back. Don't give to people who have no claim on you. If you have an enemy, hate him real good. Well, that's not where you live when you live in the kingdom of God. So that's what he's really coming to. When he comes down to the end here, he says, be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That has caused many people a lot of trouble. And I think you need to understand that the word teleoi there does not mean legal perfection. It means functional completeness. It means function in love and in kingdom reality as your Father in heaven does. It does not refer to legal righteousness, perfect adherence to the law. Give up on that one. You'll never do that, and it's a good thing you didn't, because if you did it, you'd be overwhelmed with pride. So when it's talking about being perfect, it's talking about growing into the language we used last evening from Ephesians, Paul's language, growing into the fullness of humanity in Christ, from Ephesians 4. Now, a child, for example, can be a perfect child and be a perfect teenager. That's a little harder to conceptualize, but still, as people grow, they're perfect all along the line, though they have much growing to do. And that's the kind of purpose-driven completeness that Jesus is talking about.